The top Ukrainian general talks about a stalemate at the front. Both Ukraine and Russia are making moves ahead of the winter months, and some groundbreaking news around the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. What's going on, everyone? Let's take a look at some updates as it relates to the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. I'm recording this at 1 p.m. Central on Monday, November 13th, 2023. So the Ukrainian offensive is over. Now, you're not going to see that in an official statement put out by the Ukrainian government. It just doesn't benefit them to do that. But if we look over the last couple weeks, the scale of offensive operations has changed significantly. Now, for a full assessment on that front, we'll take a look at General Zaluzhny, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, who gave a recent interview with The Economist where he said, quote, "There will most likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough." Instead, saying that, quote, "Just like in the First World War, we have reached the level of technology that puts us into a stalemate." Now, that's been a contentious subject recently. Nobody wants to hear the word stalemate when talking about a war, and it doesn't bode well for Ukraine's international support. Right? So if you look at countries all around the world that have been willing and able to support Ukraine militarily or economically since Russia's full-scale invasion, none of those countries are going to want to be on the hook to continue doing that indefinitely. Every one of them is going to want to have some sort of end in sight. You start saying stalemate, it makes it seem like this thing could go on for decades. Now, Zaluzhny continued talking about the slower than expected progress during the offensive, saying, quote, "First, I thought there was something wrong with our commanders, so I changed some of them. Then I thought maybe our soldiers are not fit for this purpose, so I moved soldiers in some brigades. Finally," he said, he realized that technology employed by the two sides put them into a relative deadlock. Now, he talks about what could break this going forward, and he says it's not one specific type of missile or one type of aircraft or anything like that. It's the fusing of multiple different types of technology into kind of a military revolution of sorts. His concern right now, understandably so, is that this war drags on indefinitely and over time just wears Ukraine down. He said, "The most expensive thing that Ukraine has is their people. But, quote, sooner or later, we're going to find that we simply don't have enough people left to fight." Now, this is a tough spot for Ukraine. The whole war has been a tough spot for Ukraine. They are not going to outnumber Russia in terms of weapons or manpower. So the next few months are really going to be focused on Ukraine trying to find ways to, for lack of a better term, outsmart their Russian adversaries. Now, at this point in the war, we've seen both sides go on the offensive. It's slow, it costs a lot of lives and material, and doesn't make a lot of progress. So the fact that Ukraine is looking for any sort of alternative over what they've done so far makes sense. I mean, at this point, it's hard to see a scenario, given the capabilities of the two sides, that Ukraine could ever forcibly remove Russia from the occupied territories. The problem is, what is that alternative? I mean, they're essentially, again, talking about a revolution in how warfare is conducted in some way, shape, or form, right? We don't generally know what that's going to be until it actually happens, but those are the type of things that are not usually willed into existence by one nation or another. So look, it makes sense that Ukraine is looking in that direction, looking for what could be next. But if that's kind of the fallback on what is needed to eventually win this war, look, your guess is as good as mine. Now, speaking of movements on the battlefield, we've got two main areas that each side is focused on right now. This is not to say that there isn't fighting going on elsewhere along the front, but really two specific areas that stand out. For Russia, the focus right now is in and around Avdiivka, which is a town that's been at the front lines since 2014, which means Ukraine has built up a pretty significant defensive network there. Now, for a few weeks, Russia's pressed the offensive to the north and the south of that town. What it looks like they're trying to do is encircle it, similar to how Russia took Bakhmut last winter. So eventually, Russian forces moved directly through the town of Bakhmut, but really when they started making progress was pushing around to the north and to the south and kind of restricting Ukraine's ability to bring reinforcements in or wounded out of that city. That looks similar to what we're seeing in Avdiivka right now. Now, the Russians appear to have suffered pretty substantial losses in and around Avdiivka at this point. So we've seen quite a few videos and pictures coming out showing Russian tanks and armored vehicles and dismounts at times moving across open terrain in daylight hours, striking mines, getting hit with drones, ATGMs, and artillery, and more armored vehicle losses from Russia than we've seen in quite a while now. But either way, they do, despite those losses, they do still appear to be making progress to both the north and the south. But through all of that, there doesn't appear to be much public discourse about Ukraine abandoning their position in Avdiivka. Now, for Ukraine, the interesting location right now is on the east bank of the Dnipro River by Kherson. So it was about a year ago, Ukraine retook Kherson from Russia, and the river has essentially served as a barrier to any sort of movement ever since. Now, there have been assorted Ukrainian raids across that river for quite a while now, and at times they've stuck around for a few weeks, inflicting damage on Russian forces. But now we're starting to see reports that they're reinforcing the east bank of the Dnieper with armored vehicles, which is, look, getting across a river in the middle of a war at baseline is a challenge. Moving armored vehicles across a river in the middle of a war it's another beast altogether. So what this looks like is the Ukraine may intend to expand that beachhead and try to push further inland. Now, this is likely what we can expect from Ukraine over the coming winter months. So company-sized operations designed to inflict losses on the Russians, but overall, more than the losses they're going to inflict or the territory they're going to take, keep Russian forces on their toes. Now, last winter, while much of the focus was in and around Bakhmut, Ukraine really wasn't going on the offensive anywhere. I mean, there were attacks, but nothing significant. There were a handful of reasons for this, but one major aspect was that this was during the time when Ukrainian forces were being trained by their Western partners, sometimes in Ukraine, sometimes outside of Ukraine, and tons of new equipment was flowing into the country. So unfortunately, that lull of Ukraine not attacking really anywhere across the front gave Russia the time and space to build significant defenses all across the front that gave Ukraine such a challenging time during their offensive this past summer. So lesson learned, you can't let up. You can't let the Russians easily reinforce any of their positions. So pretty big news came out over the weekend around the Nord Stream pipeline attack, which I think at this point, you can probably find an article that says Russia did it, the U.S. did it. I think I saw one about the U.K. and Poland. Ukraine was named at one point, and now we got an actual individual called out for his role. This was published in the Washington Post. They said Roman Chernivsky, a decorated 48-year-old colonel who served in Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, was the coordinator of the Nord Stream operation, people familiar with his role said, managing logistics and support for a 6-person team that rented a sailboat under false identities and used deep-sea diving equipment to place explosive charges on the gas pipeline. Continuing on, they say Chernivsky did not act alone, and he did not plan the operation, according to people familiar with his role, which has not been previously reported. The officer took orders from more senior Ukrainian officials who ultimately reported to General Zaluzhny, Ukraine's highest-ranking military officer. Now, supposedly, Chernivsky was arrested and is currently being detained by Ukraine. So that's pretty significant, right? I mean, to be fair, Chernivsky here, through his lawyer, said that all speculations about my involvement in the attack on Nord Stream are being spread by Russian propaganda without any basis, and he said his arrest and prosecution were political retribution for his criticism of Ukrainian President Zelensky and his administration. So there's a lot happening here. I mean, you have to consider that Chernivsky said, I have nothing to do with this, I don't know what this is about. But I thought it was interesting when he said that his arrest was political retribution for his criticism of Zelensky and his administration. This is not going to go over well for Ukraine at all. So I don't know that the move to lock up somebody that you don't like, who's critical of you or your government, is to claim responsibility for the Nord Stream pipeline attack. Seems like not, shoot yourself in the foot to get this guy. If that's the actual course here. We'll see. I haven't seen a lot of the international response quite yet. Russia jumped on this pretty quickly, saying, we're deeply concerned about what we've seen in the news here. But at the time of the bombing, there were people talking about Article 5, NATO, right? An attack on one is an attack on all, as viewing the Nord Stream pipeline as critical infrastructure to NATO countries. The argument here, there could be a couple arguments here as to the motive as to why Ukraine did this, the argument would be, should this be proven, one is that it would shut off Russian gas profits for the winter, right? They also wouldn't be able to as effectively blackmail parts of Europe by shutting that off themselves. And the second that has been speculated is a desire to potentially pull NATO directly into the war with Russia. Now, to be fair, assigning motive for any party responsible here is just pure speculation at this point, but it's pretty significant, putting a name and a face to the Nord Stream pipeline bombing. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in national security subjects, be sure to check out the sit reps I put out on Substack. Link is in the description below. 7 to 10 of the top stories each week, along with a few podcast recommendations. But thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.